I know that a lot of people talk about dance as a non-verbal form of communication. I think that identity perhaps is a little reductive to what this form is. Not to say that, communication is not important, it's extremely important and it's central to how we all understand each other. So it's very important. It's not always quiet. The conversations can be loud sometimes, could be discursive many a times, even angry at times. So you're doing this very solo act in a public platform. So it's a very interesting thing. You see what the people see and what they get is really their own conversation with themselves. They're not getting anything that I'm saying because I'm having a conversation with myself. What the greatest treatises and texts of dramaturgy, dance, like Natyashastra, any other text in the Indian aesthetic realm also tell you. The character, when you're an actor and you're playing a character amidst other characters, then you have the luxury of identifying with one's own character. That is the character that you've been assigned. If I can shock you a bit and say that we our understanding of what and where these art forms began, researchers like me, that's what I constantly do.
Welcome to Speak with Anuj, Dr. Swarnamalya. Thank you so much for taking the time out. This is incredible to just have you on the other end of the screen, really, to have this conversation with you. Your expertise, your immense experience is something that I'd love to take insights from to a very interesting aspect of communication, which is through dance and rhythm. The idea of starting this podcast was to just be able to learn from communication styles and improve my own way of communicating with the world, and hopefully have people empowered to speak better. And as I was mentioning to you a little while ago, that mostly we associate communication with the spoken word. We associate with speeches or with dialogues, but there is a lot more to it. And that is something that I'm hoping to learn from you, from your expertise in dance and performing arts.
Thank you very much for having me here, Anuji. It's such a pleasure to talk to you and to be part of your podcast. And what a lovely initiative. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
So you've been a proponent, a practitioner of classical dance forms, and there's a lot of research work that you've done into not just understanding them but preserving them for posterity. I'm curious to know. Communication often begins with homework. Any communicator's core element is homework and research, and I'm sure there's tremendous amount of research and work that's gone into just understanding the art form that you practice. What questions did you find yourself asking about the craft when you stepped into it?
When I stepped into it would be a fast stretch because I started learning the art form as young as when I was 3 and went on stage to perform my debut at the age of 12. So I now looking back, I think those were the years when one was taught rather intuitively how to use the craft. But I think my conscious thinking about it began a bit later, maybe in my late teens, one can say. Think about the form. I know that a lot of people talk about dance as a non-verbal form of communication. While it is that, I think that identity perhaps is a little reductive to what this form is. Not to say that, communication is not important, it's extremely important and it's central to how we all understand each other. So it's very important. But I think the art form that I have been inculcated in is also a very internalized, again, dialogue with one's own self. In that sense, it's not external communication, but it's a very inward introspective journey to understand one's own self. So in that sense, the storytelling, the need to speak to others started reducing slowly, and eventually, it comes to a point where you realize that the conversation is really with one's own self. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Absolutely does. What a fascinating dimension of communication you've shed light on, because before you begin to communicate with the world around you, it is important that you start communicating with yourself to understand what you are made of, what you stand for, what really sparks that fire in you. And You said something very interesting, that the dialogue with the world around you stops, reduces, and it increases internally. Does it become meditative as a process?
It's meditative, but not necessarily only in the spiritual sense, right? So
Sure.
it's not always quiet. The conversations can be loud sometimes, could be discursive many a times, even angry at times. So it's very emotive, not necessarily only sort of pensive in that meditative sense, but it's meditative in the sense that it's lonely. So it's a very self-aware journey. There is no one else with you in that conversation, it's you with yourself. But because it's a craft that's meant for everyone to see, you are also sharing it you're doing this very solo act in a public platform. So it's a very interesting thing. You see, what the people see and what they get is really their own conversation with themselves. They're not getting anything that I'm saying, because I'm having a conversation with myself. So it's the
Ah. Oh, beautiful.
right. So what you
I'm
see
I'm,
as
I'm
my
going to take a second to reflect. Wow.
no, I mean, and when you look at me performing, and this is what the greatest treatises and texts of dramaturgy, dance, like Natyashastra, any other text in the Indian aesthetic realm also tell you, right? Eventually, the artist is in a conversation with themselves. The audience are watching the artist, but not really in conversation with the artist, but in a conversation with their own emotions. So it's the alchemy of these two that a certain communication happens.
Okay. So communication, being a communicator or an artist, is really being a facilitator for that conversation
That's
the
right.
audience is going to have
That's
with
right.
themselves. How do you see yourself transform through that process of being a facilitator,
Oh,
the
it's
conduit?
tremendous. I mean, it's tremendous when you think of it from this point, this perspective. But invariably, as a dancer or as an artist, you are always immersed in the craft, right? So the craft often takes precedence. It sits lightly on your shoulders, this role of a facilitator, because you are not allowed to think of that. You're allowed to obsess about the craft. But in the process of obsessing about the craft itself, one realizes that one has, in many ways, facilitated that conversation for oneself and for others. So it can't be about taking on that role very seriously. It has to be about the goal towards perfecting the craft, and then the communication happens nonetheless.
So now there is you as an artist. There is the performance that you are portraying in front of the audience. There is a character that you are playing. What is the dialogue you have between you and the character before you step into it?
That's a great question. I mean, see, I wear more than one hat, which is also that of an actor, apart from a dancer. So I could perhaps answer this question better from the perspective of an actor. I'll tell you why. Because Sadr, which is the form I perform, which is the subaltern form of Bharatanatyam, um, is essentially, and I keep saying this over and over again, is not a storytelling format. So we work a lot with emotions rather than characters. So it's a very intuitive form. It's a very self-reflexive form. If you see it, you'll know what I mean. So it's in that sense what the kind of dance that we see today, or we are used to seeing today, where there's a lot of narrative storytelling, that may be largely absent, but the same stories will be looked at from the emotive perspective. So, dance in that sense for me is a slightly different exercise. But as an actor, the character, when you're an actor and you're playing a character amidst other characters, then you have the luxury of identifying with one's own character. That is the character that you've been assigned, right? You can actually immerse, and you can really think of being in the shoes of that character, because you have no other role to play. You have a singular role to play, and that role also takes on your personality, whether we like it or not. So it's a bit of you that comes into the character. So you have that very interpersonal relationship that you build with the character you're portraying. But as a dancer, though, I mean, also even this the few times that one is narrating a story, one happens to narrate a story from multiple perspectives. So there are many characters that one has to portray because it's a solo form. It's not a dramatic form where there are multiple people playing characters. So you don't delve into any character long enough to become that. You are always
Hmm.
you're always yourself with one foot in the character. You know it, your audience know it, and that's why it's in that sense it's a very narrative form. So you take them along, and it's a very suggestive form in that sense. It's not real like.
Yes. Wow. If I could draw a parallel there, like when I used to be a host of a radio show, there was a certain amount of my personality that came into the time when I was in front of the mic and talking to an entire city. But there were certain aspects of me that I kept away, and there's certain aspects of me that I brought
Yeah.
in, and that constant uh, dichotomy or the duality of life. Because once I step out of the radio studio, I am no longer that RJ. Like, I'm not waking up in the morning and talking to my wife saying, "Hey, good morning. It's a lovely day today."
Yeah.
But there is a certain part of that within
Yeah.
me. Uh, how much does the audience dictate the flow of communication in performance versus the other way around?
In Bharatanatyam, I can speak for Bharatanatyam because the majority of my colleagues are all Bharatanatyam dancers. They call themselves that. So the form itself, which is a very modern form, a post colonial form, I think the audience interaction is very minimal because it's a proscenium art. That is, the artist is on the stage, the audience are in the audience arena. So it's meant to be minimal. Whereas Sadir,
Hmm.
which evolved from the courts and the temples, and it came through a very interactive process because it ceased to exist when stage art began. And in reviving it, you're reviving not just the form, but you're reviving the manner and the context in which the form was created. In many ways, Sadir is far more interactive. It's in fact the pulse of the audience becomes central to what you're going to perform next, how you're going to perform, what you're going to perform. It's very extempore, intuitive, and interactive.
When you think of traditional and classical performing art forms, there is certain structure that is constantly followed and, of course, evolved, because art will evolve by the very nature of it.
Absolutely.
However, there is constantly a debate between authenticity and conformity. There is that tussle and tug of war. How do you navigate that?
Oh, I have. I mean, I remember about almost 15 years ago, I wrote an article and I titled it "Notions of Classicism," right? And of course, I mean, people were shocked because at that point in time, people we were not even ready to question any aspect of anything that we call as tradition or classical. But what is this notion? And is it the static conformity, as you call it? Is it the conformity to something that is unchanging, or is it the understanding that it's an ebb and flow, right? As King Lear would say, right? The ebb and flow of a tradition that is a legacy, right? No doubt, but a legacy that nonetheless is passed by humans to humans, and therefore, will undergo a sea change in every generation, perhaps, or even within a generation, right? And how do we embrace this without losing its legacy? I think for me, terms like legacy and heritage and tradition hold a lot more fluidity in my head, in my mind. It's fluid, it's moving, it's changing, it's dynamic, and without, of course, sort of entirely dismantling it or disenfranchising it. That is, of course, there. But it's not anything that is only to be conformed. It's to be conformed by also changing it or changing with it.
Hmm. Now, with art, we include language, we include music, we include rituals and practices, and again, as we go decade after decade, owing to the cultural ecosystem that is constantly evolving, so do these evolve. don't they have an impact on where the performing arts began and how they're being portrayed now? How they're influencing the storytelling that's going on.
Yes, I think, I mean, if I can shock you a bit and say that our understanding of what and where these art forms began is by itself debatable and questionable, and researchers like me, that's what I constantly do. Right, where did it begin?
Mm.
Did it begin where you believe it began, or did it begin elsewhere, which makes you very uncomfortable today because it's not at all where we place ourselves, right?
True,
So
true,
those
true.
questions exist, but I think today's art forms um, are reflective of how we contextualize the past, right? So the minute we help the younger generation or even our own generation recontextualize it a little bit, I think it'll change the way we approach the form. Right, it is. I mean, for example, just bringing Sadr into the equation as a form, as a legitimate way of acknowledging the past, a legitimate way of acknowledging legacies, in many ways has for me within my own generation changed a lot of the conversations that were had before.
If you could give me an example of
you know I mean, something like, again, as you said, origin theories, right? So we keep talking about the origin theory of dance. Until about 15 years ago, it was okay and it was acceptable to only think of the origin of this form from, say, Lord Nataraja as the cosmic dancer, a celestial mythical origin. But it is the humans of the form, it is the people of the form, it is the generations of artists and gurus, and particularly the women performers like the Devadasis, from whom some of us have had the opportunity to directly learn, and therefore become sort of the carriers of some of these important voices, not as a voice amidst them, but as people who can help shine a light to their original voice.
hmm,
I think it's very
hmm,
important. And by doing that, by merely re reinstating Sadr as a very legitimate way of performing, I think we've shifted conversations within the dance traditions. Today, people, even though they may talk about Nataraja and the cosmic dancer, they pause a bit to say, but there are also more human legacies, the immediate past.
hmm,
So
hmm.
to bring that into the conversation has taken over a decade. So it's a slow process, but no doubt recontextualizing the arts will shift the way we communicate about our past.
Wow. Now, communication also often requires breaking patterns of predictability, which is something that the human mind tends to fall back into patterns of comfort because it gives you a certain sense of security that this is how I understand it, this is how it goes. But I believe that the people who have broken predictable patterns are the outliers and therefore are called
Mhm,
artists,
yeah.
because that's where it lies. Uh, how do you experience it now in a modern context with the amplification happening because of the internet, because of everyone bringing their own context, the over contextualization of information or tradition?
No, I think that's so well put. I mean, the outliers today, everybody is an outlier. So, one is wondering, everybody is, when you say think outside the box, everybody is thinking outside the box. So it's an expanding universe in that sense of communication, right? I mean, there's a one man up ship. Even within the technological world, there's one man up ship of how best am I going to reach the other person's ear, sooner, louder, so on, right? So I'm not entirely sure that sort of one man up ship is productive, in the sense that I think it takes away a lot of the solitude which is required for creativity, which is required for a certain cognitive progress. So I think that is a little detrimental. But for the arts, if one were to pause for a moment and look at, say, for example, the Instagram deluge as art, right, and the content creation, the it word, right, the content creation as art, then there's a lot of lessons to take. I mean, how many ways have we identified to verbally, non-verbally, pictorially, and otherwise communicate all our emotions. I mean, we've been able to shrink what we've been able to say through the long form, say cinema, to short form, but now the shortest form, which is the reels and the rest, right? I mean, just a few seconds, maybe like half a minute. So our ability to communicate has become quicker, has become more efficient, and also very nonverbal. So in many ways, artistically, it's a great, it's a march towards something quite new. But that said, I
Mm.
think because of the sheer nature of how technology shrinks your ability to say everything quickly, very, very, it also takes away perhaps the poetics of saying it in the long form, poetics of, being able to, write a letter to someone, for example, and all
Mm.
that
Mm.
romance and all that joy that exists within the traditional arts. I think that's something that today's communication has not been able to capture. So, as someone who lives in a bit of both worlds, I enjoy both. And I sometimes fear that a lot of young people have lost out on that.
On the slow joy of art,
I
right?
agree. I mean, don't you?
Right.
I'm sure you read poetry and read the books, and I mean, just silencing the phone and going back to a book and having the energy to read a book and wait for its finish
Yeah.
rather than sort of scroll to the very end. I think that's a joy.
And then there is also the pain of realizing that you can't focus as much anymore because you sit with a book, and there was a time when you could read through a whole book
Yes,
in a couple of sittings, or maybe one
absolutely.
sitting. And now it takes a few sittings to get through a few
Absolutely,
chapters because
absolutely.
your brain is looking for the next
And I've seen
distraction.
young people sort of try and, expand a physical book, hoping that it would, like, whatever, like the visuals would expand. So, I mean, we are in that age where young people have no understanding of what it is to have that patience.
So, which brings me to my next question. To In order for the audience to be able to immerse into your performance, what does a performer need to keep in mind?
What does the performer need
For
to do?
them, it takes it. What does a performer need to do to have the audience immerse into their performance?
Ah, it's very simple. You have to be immersed. There's nothing you can do to get the
Mm.
other person to immerse themselves. You just have to be so immersed that you don't care that the other person is immersed or not. And then they will be immersed,
Beautiful,
right? So there is no shortcut to it. There is no other way to do it. You have to be unmindful of the world around you.
beautiful, beautiful. And does that process, where does that process begin? Um of course, through your training, you're focusing, I was speaking with a musician friend of mine on a previous episode, and he told me the difference between practicing and rehearsing, between sadhana and just doing something repeatedly.
Mhm,
So sadhana is where, when you attempt to become one with the art, or it becomes a part of you, as we were
mhm.
discussing earlier. At what point do you realize that you've now stepped into the zone, that you are in sadhana now?
It's very hard for us to be in realization of the fact that we are in a zone, because that very realization takes you out of the zone. The fact that you
Mm.
don't know what's happening is that moment. It's a fleeting moment, I must say. It doesn't come to all artists all the time. The best of us,
Mm.
with tremendous practice, will still be able to have that atonement, maybe for a few moments in a concert if one is lucky. But that said, the repetitive practice, whether we call it sadhana or we call it practice, whatever it is, the repetitive ability to go back to something and keep at it and do it like a pensive, meditative repetition over and over again, it builds a certain relationship with the craft, with the piece, with the poetry, music, whatever it is, dance, movement. And it is in that familiarity that you lose yourself. So one has to be so familiar with it, which is why, artists and teachers or gurus will always insist on practice. It's not so that, your body can muscle memorize the movements. It is so that you are so comfortable and so in atoned with the piece, that something beyond what is required comes up. And for that beyond to come, you need to be really in in that atonement with the piece. And you cannot force it. You will not know how many months into practice that will happen. Sometimes it could happen right
Mm.
away, it could happen, sometimes it never happens. With a certain piece you're always uncomfortable. So as an artist, we are all very vulnerable also, right? Because it's a live art. It's not it's not a recorded form in that sense, where you can go back and so you are good, and you have your good days, and then you have your not so good days. Only you will know what those are. But because you've practiced for long enough, the audience get a certain immersive experience out of this, because they're also immersed and so are you, but you're immersed all the time. When that moment happens is not for anyone to predict.
How does this translate onto the screen or the camera instead of the live stage? Because you've of course acted in some phenomenal productions, and you've hosted television productions as well. How does this translate to the camera? Because there is a very rigid structure of doing things, and please shine some light on that.
See, I think, like I said, the first thing that I think is very helpful is because you're playing characters, right? There is a
Mm.
certain sense of who you are, and that identification becomes a little more easier. Here, because you're yourself on the stage, there is a lot you have to correlate and deal with. But
Mm.
when you are portraying a particular character, there is a definitive structure to it. When does it begin, what does it do, where does it go, how does it end, because there is also a co-actor with you who works with you within that context.
Right.
So in some
Right.
sense there is a certain as you rightly put it, a certain boundary to work within, and it's more helpful. But whether it's television or any live show, again, I think the fact that you put yourself out there and you hope that that's the moment. I think that's all there is to creating any art. You can't really, if you aim for the sky, I doubt one can even take off to fly. Yes, you have to aim for it in the sense that in the larger context you want to, but it can't be a
Yeah.
goal. You see, you
Mm.
should be able to enjoy the imperfections of what happens, right? You can't beat yourself about those things. So I always encourage both myself and my students to embrace the imperfections as much as the perfections. It's You can't land in a perfect way. You have to keep at it. And the more imperfect you are, the better, because you have many more chances to go at it again and again. So it's
Mm.
fine, it's
Mm.
great. It's that process that the audience enjoy, whether it's on stage or even on screen. If you see, the best actors are those who've had average performances that have somehow at some point culminated into some fantastic performances. It's the patience with which you are able to build yourself to it, and the audience are able to travel with you through it, that makes you a fine actor.
In this case, and with regards to the medium of cinema or television, I would imagine that there is the audience is different. Your audience at that point is the director,
Mhm.
not necessarily the audience is sitting in the screen in the theater hall watching the film. Your audience right now is the
Yeah,
director, and the instructions or the perspective that the director has given.
yeah,
If this audience is satisfied with the outcome of the performance, then there are many factors that come together to put it forward onto the
yeah.
screen. So often, does that make a difference? Because if you're on camera thinking about the final audience that is actually going to watch, then there could be a disjoint between
Absolutely. Neither should we, nor should the director think of the final audience, right? The best directors I have seen, at least, are the ones who have worked again very much like how we artists work on stage, right? They create something that sits very well with them, that makes a lot of sense to their way of storytelling, right? So they are etching something on a canvas, and we become the sort of the paint brushes, but the strokes are theirs, right? So in that sense, they understand the final outcome, and in that sense they are puzzling up, putting us together as a puzzle. But they're not thinking of the audience. They're not thinking of the awards, they're not thinking of the applause. If they did that, then I think the outcomes of those are far less emotive and put together.
Hmm.
But I think
Hmm.
for me, the best of directors have also been the ones who've allowed the emotive quality in me to emerge rather than force a certain particular way of doing something. People who've said
Hmm.
do what comes naturally have been some of the best directors, so who've had the patience. I think I'm coming back to the word patience over and over again. I mean, I think for all of these arts, I think that's a key word, to wait for. I mean, you speak of communication, to wait for the next word to emerge, right, rather than preempt it. I think that's
Hmm.
probably key. And it's a wonderful listening technique, right, where you listen to the silence, you listen to the pauses, you wait for something that's not said, so you get a better picture. Probably that's what it is.
And I would assume Mani Ratnam is the kind of director who would wait for it to emerge,
Very
who would
much,
probably give
very
you that
much.
space. Hmm. It also reflects in the music that he employs, which is of course A.R. Rahman, who will wait for the singer to for that note to emerge, for that texture to emerge, and he gives them their time to, yeah. In your students, when you teach, have you observed dance or the ability to hone their physical expression influence the way they speak?
Absolutely. I think some of the best compliments that they get is that they are identified as a dancer the instant they walk into a room, whether it's their gait or in the manner in which they speak, the gestures. So I think they get identified as an artist or a dancer the instant they are in the company of others. But I think also my students, particularly, one of the things I encourage them to do, apart from, sort of becoming loud in the sense of using your hands to be more expressive or whatever the other forms of communication are, is to become keen listeners. Because for an emerging artist, I think it's very important to be a good listener. There's much that one can gain from that sort of calming down. So I always tell them, don't speak first, allow others to speak so that we can hear what they have to say, and then let's see if there is a response that is required, right? So I mean, these don't come from me as sort of directives, but I think the craft and some of the pieces that we work with naturally also brings instill some of these values in them. So they eventually they turn up to be a lot more thinker, like better thinkers, deeper thinkers.
Hmm, hmm,
So I think
hmm.
that's a great
and
form of
and you
communication. Sorry.
and you don't have to be uh, you don't have to lifelong be in a professional dancer. You could imbibe the training, and then it shows itself in any profession that you take up.
Very
It
much.
impacts any form of any way of life that you take up.
Very
There
much.
is a certain rhythm that incorporates within you.
Absolutely. My guru, uh, Sarasama, who was from the hereditary community of dancers, used to say, of course, jokingly, that once a dancer, then even if the girl gives up dance and, the parents choose to get her married and, she goes away to the US and she makes the first dosa and she says, there she would reveal herself and everybody would know that she's a dancer. So, in every act of
Ah,
yours, in every act of yours, my guru would say that, if you're once a dancer, always a dancer.
I just pictured this whole scene playing out, and then suddenly everyone looks up and goes, "Oh wow, we didn't know
Something very,
about this."
I think there's a very artistic, a very sort of a creative way of doing things, is what I think she means.
Hmm. How does communication look like in a group performance now, especially when you're on stage? You're not actively communicating with each other, but you are,
Yeah.
right? And how do those group dynamics work when there is different people?
Before I tell you about, working with my students, regular my regular ensemble, I must share a very unique and beautiful experience I had almost 20 years ago. Performing, I was invited to perform in Bangalore with a group of blind dancers, all of them blind, and all of them exceptionally trained Bharatanatyam dancers. And they had invited me to be part of their group as the lead dancer, and we would all perform together. And they said 3 or 4 rehearsals would do. So I was quite surprised. So I flew to Bangalore a couple of times to work with them for the rehearsals, and then once for the show. And that's all we had. It was incredible. I had no idea, and I was much younger too. So I think I also didn't know how to process how they had incredibly learned the form and also learned a certain stage craft, that beats even the ones who can visually see, right? They were not, no clashes, no hitches, none whatsoever. I remember we did a Narasimha Avatara, where, I had to play Hiranyakashipu, and then the Narasimha would come and, drag me to the center of the stage, to the spotlight. All of this was done seamlessly with absolutely no hitch whatsoever, no verbal communication on the stage, nothing. I only remember a single uh, black thread that was tied to the center of the stage, like an X, just for their feet to understand the center. Other than that, there was
Oh, wow.
absolutely nothing
Right.
else. I remember no communication verbally or whatever. So I
Mm.
when you sent me that question, I was thinking of that incredible performance. And of course, I was rather young to have a more deeper conversation with them to understand how they managed to do it. But I was in awe back then and even now of how they were able to. So such is the precision with which dancers are able to. I mean, if blind dancers are able to do that, what of the ones who can actually see? So we get into a rhythm, right? A certain, and that's why working with the same set of people becomes important. So it has a lot to do with, a lot, as you might know, in theater we have these trust exercises, we have, rapport building. It's the same with dance. So you become a family, you become sort of each other's support system. You know whose calf muscles are paining for the day, who forgets which movement at which particular time. So you are, so in many ways everybody has got everybody's cues. So it's a community exercise. It's not just about communication. So you develop into a community, and you are looking out for each other. And what I think makes it most communicative without even words is the fact that you know each other's limitations more than you know each other's strengths. And knowing that you have to cover up the other person's limitations in order for all of us to win together. That's what makes the group work very important. It's not just about you doing your best. If you did your best and everyone else did something wrong, you would still be the one odd man out. So it doesn't make you win, right? Not in that
Yeah.
context. So if you have to flow with the rhythm, that you're able to make the exact same mistake that your friend is going to make, and then laugh about it, because no one else except you both know about it. The audience thinks that's how it's meant
Oh,
to
that
be.
happens. Yeah, that happens sometimes, and I tell my students this when they go up to on stage to communicate, and I say this audience is not sitting with a script.
Exactly.
They don't know that you might be skipping the seventh sentence and going on to the 12th. That's perfectly fine. The two of you know, like when there are two people, and in school, when you have the boy and girl coming out and giving the school report, tell them it's all right. Jump back, you know, fill in something because you know what's happened and what hasn't. uh, the example that you gave about the blind dancers, I host a lot of corporate events. I've been doing that for the last 20 years, and I often get to experience performances that just blow my mind. One of them recently was a group of dancers who came out to perform a classical piece, and they were all deaf. So much so that I had to go up, when before introducing them, I had to tell the audience that, listen, they can't hear you applaud, so do this, with your hands, so they know that you're applauding for them. And they came out, and there was music, of course, for the benefit of the audience, but they couldn't hear anything. But they performed seamlessly, and then just completed and went back, and the beat, the rhythm, the it what a mind-blowing experience that was. I've also experienced differently abled artists who have various physical abilities. Somebody can't see, somebody can't hear, or somebody's in a wheelchair, but they all come together and perform. And not just that, backstage when they're changing their props and their outfits, there's nobody helping them. They're doing it on their own, and within 10 seconds they've gone back, changed, come back on stage seamlessly. And it's such an inspiration because, and then you ask the question, so what's your excuse? You just,
Yeah. No, I think it's the rhythm of it all, right? So it's not just about getting on the stage and putting on a show. It's about living the
mm,
life of an artist. It's about knowing every aspect of the art making, including the backstage and what it is to walk that many number of steps before you reach that bottle of water, to take that sip of water. All of it becomes a part of the entire choreography of being an
mm,
artist.
mm.
So, and I'm pretty sure as a communications teacher, you also teach your students to do the same, right? Everything from what you eat that morning to what you wear to
Yes,
all of that
yes.
has a huge role to play in how you end up speaking and then getting back. So I think all of it is performative in that sense.
Something as simple as when you are experiencing anxiety before getting on stage, your body is in the fight or flight mode. The temperature starts rising because your body is now ready to react. All you have to do is hold a cold beverage in your hand,
Wow.
and automatically the temperature of your body starts equalizing.
Right.
You're not as battle ready, and that increases your anxiety. Just hold a cold bottle of water,
It's fantastic.
and you'll slowly see how it comes. It's very simple. What you eat in the morning, like you rightly said, affects how you perform in the afternoon or in the evening, because food has
Yep,
that, it's a biological reaction happening in
absolutely.
your body. uh, that there are just so many things that are interconnected, and which is why, again, I'm speaking with people from various walks of life. For instance, a doctor, how would you communicate hope to your parents, to your patients, morning to evening? It is
Yep,
communication. If you are anxious yourself, if you haven't practiced communication yourself, you might end up making your patients more
that's
anxious.
right.
But you go back to a particular doctor from the hundreds of thousands available because of how that person makes you feel. And there are so many things you can employ. One very important aspect of communication and performance is breath work.
Hmm.
Is just simply breathing and delivering the performance at the same time, the very thing that keeps us going. How do you train breath work? How do you practice breath work when you are trained to be a performer?
So in Sadar, the additional role that the dancer plays is also that of a singer. So we often
Mm,
also sing as we perform. That's not how Bharatanatyam dancers do it, but Sadar artists are supposed to also, every now and then, if not the whole time, sing. So the breath work becomes that much more vital for us because we can't be out of breath while we're singing, or for that matter, after that for dancing. So
mm,
it's a very simple technique. One of the things that my gurus taught me when I was very young was to never breathe through the mouth. So a lot of the times, your biological limitations, for example, if you had a septum, deviated septum, I would understand it as a teacher very early on, even before your parents can detect it, because I would have asked you to breathe through your nose, and if you've struggled, then I would immediately understand that there is some kind of a disturbance, and so I would probably ask your parents to then take you to an ENT. And invariably these things always find the teacher's eye quickly. So breathing through the mouth, breathing through the nose and not the nostrils alone. uh, it's a very structured breathing. Just some time ago I was reading a book, and it spoke about identifying one's consciousness through breath. I mean, it's a spiritual exercise, but they spoke about how in the rhythm of one's breath one is able to identify certain realities of their own self consciousness. But all that spirituality aside, if I shut my mouth and if I only breathe through my nose, it's a very hard exercise, especially when you're out of breath, right? Because you dance, the first thing you want to do is take a lot of breath, right? So when I minimize that, and when I completely realize that my nostrils are my only way to breathe in or out, then my capacity increases. So when you limit, I'm also increased in capacity. It's very similar to how this world functions. You see, when they limit us, we become more full of capacity, right? So,
Yes.
so in many ways,
Oh, there's so many dimensions to that sentence.
right? So I know initially I tell my students it's a very hard task. It also sounds rather harsh, not harsh, but rather unrealistic when I tell them, when they're completely out of breath. I tell them, you know what, now shut your mouth and breathe through your nose, right? And I also tell them, when you're really in great amount of pain, smile more. The more you smile, I know that you're more in pain. Right now, it sounds like a very harsh thing to do, rather sadistic, but it's also a great life lesson, right, for all of us. I tell my students, when we smile more, when we are more effervescent, we know that life is not easy. So similarly, breath work is very simple. That's literally how the only way we regain our lost energies as we continue to perform. Because sometimes our rhythmic sections are 5, 6, 7 minute long, non-stop, and that requires a tremendous amount of breath control, and all of it comes from only that. So there is no other particular way in which we work except to only use the nostrils to breathe.
In fact, very interesting. I'd read this some years ago, where it made so much sense that before singing, if students were encouraged to go out and play and run a few laps around the ground and then come back and sing, their entire vocal stamina, their lung power would increase. They would be able to hit the notes easier,
Right.
because now there is the body has opened up. Similarly, it's normally reduced down to a very catchy proverb: all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy.
Right.
But if Jack goes out and runs and plays, then Jack is breathing better.
Right.
Therefore, the circulation of blood within the body and all the positivity that's coming into the body
Yes,
is impacting the way Jack focuses
that's right.
on study, which is why you have games periods in schools.
That's right.
It's nothing separate from academics. It's a part of the entire learning ecosystem.
Absolutely.
How does dance help boost confidence, refine body language, and constantly make you a better version of yourself that you're presenting to the world?
I, well, see, I think this persona that dancers put on, in the way we dress and the way we walk, all of that is on the one side, of course. That's a very tangible, visual um, transformation. But I think what dance can do, and if it's learned well and taught mindfully and learned mindfully, and if you're allowed to think as a dancer, not just sort of be a clone of the dancers of the past or your one's own guru, but if you're given allowed the space to develop a personality around you being an artist. I think what it really does is it it boosts a sense of self, and that is invariably the only reason why most of us feel a little diffident, isn't it? That we don't know who we are, or that this self that we think we are is not enough, so on. So I think what dance does is it helps you identify the best aspects of you, while it also helps you identify the negatives or the shortcomings in oneself. It also in many ways shows you that these shortcomings need not always be shortcomings, right? I mean, there are, like, for example, one's color or one's height. I mean, I'm talking about just physical attributes, right? In the world in which we live, it's a very harsh world where somebody who's shorter than what we think of as the right attractive height, so on, are often made to feel less. But
Hmm.
through practicing of an art form like dance, what we end up doing is help them understand stature, help them understand gait, help them understand how wonderful it could be to embrace that that stature of theirs, and then they feel extremely confident, um, uh, extremely good about themselves, I think. So those are aspect, but all of this, I must say, does not come automatically if you just simply learn dance. You have to learn it the right
Mm.
way, the mindful way. Otherwise, it can end up making you feel a lot less about yourself, I must say. There are lots of teachers, unfortunately, around the world who teach this form in a very physical manner, like how like how the glamorous world of cinema is, right? Where, it
Yeah.
accentuates, puts so much accent on one's body and one's, especially for women, that you make them feel so small about themselves throughout their lives. So dance can also do that because it's a very physical form. But if you learn it mindfully, then there is tremendous scope to really become very confident in one's own skin.
This is a very key point that you've made about mindfulness in learning any performing art form, in this context, communication. Because when I speak to my students, I constantly tell them that empathy is a very, very important aspect of being a communicator. To mindfully approach the art of communication and learn how to structure your words, we all have the same 26 letters in the alphabet. It's how you make the words and sentences that says a lot about who you are. Each one of us has the same 26, but that sense of empathy is inculcated with mindful learning, being mindful of audiences, being mindful of people that you're communicating with. So, and dance has constantly reflected empathy, has constantly propagated empathy in tradition or in culture. uh, whether it is Kathak, whether it's Bharatnatyam, whether it's Kuchipudi, whether it's Kathakali, or any performing art form, how important has empathy played a role in dance?
No, of course. I mean, empathy is critical to all forms of character building, but also other empathy along with all other very important emotions, right? I mean, as a Sadhar artist or as an artist, I mean, whether an actor or a dancer or whatever, I think the human emotions and the palette of all human emotions become so critical for us to work with. You become vulnerable enough, or you keep yourself vulnerable enough to feel all of these emotions, right? It could even be anger at some point, it could be empathy, of course, but it could be many other emotions. And only when one is open and vulnerable enough to accept the onslaught of these emotions, which is why artists are called vulnerable. Yes, we are. I mean, you spend a lot of time learning to get the guard down, right? You are, so that you can, as you say, emotions can have an impact on you. So for me, I think all emotions and empathy, of course, very important. But sometimes it's also not just empathy, right? I mean, it's the ability to feel for one's own self. Sometimes that's lost. When I recently, I asked my students to think about patriarchy, in some context, and they only came up with empathetic situations that are in the lives of others. And then I looked at them and I said, this is all
Hmm.
wonderful. What about in your own life? And in their own life, they had normalized patriarchy to such a large extent that it didn't meet their eye. So I said, for a moment, I think it's very important to be more vulnerable than empathetic and ask, how has this affected me? So yes, so I mean, I'm with you for empathy, but I think we need empathy and a whole other set of emotions, perhaps also, to to be receptive.
No, thank you for adding that perspective. In fact, with emotions and vulnerability, they transcend
That's
language,
right.
right? And this is where I'm coming to the point of you performing for audiences from across the world, communicating to national and international audiences. How do you ensure that the message cuts across to everybody uniformly?
I have no message to give.
Hmm.
There is a message to be shared, but that
Mhm.
message will come and emerge from the collective experience of my performance and somebody else watching the performance. So there is no message that I go with, but I wait for the performance to create a moment of magic where I have come to say something and you have come to hear something. It may not be the same, but we end up having a conversation. And within that context, there is a message that has emerged. And part of that success is in me, and part of that success is in the listener or the viewer who could belong to whichever part of the world. And it's only post performance, or many a times, when they write a letter to me, or when they share their testimonial with me after the show, that I've understood that that's what's emerged. So there is no particular message with which I go. Like, for example, I just returned from Pakistan. I performed at the Fairs Festival there, and
Ah.
it's a completely new audience to Sadr. And of course, I performed some of Faisab's poetry. I performed it in Tamil, though, and as a translation. And what emerged from that is for the audience and for me. I mean, in that moment where they applauded and they cried, and these are multivarious emotions. And so there is not a single message that's gone, but multiple messages, much beyond my capacity to even share a message.
In fact, I was at Jashne Rekhta a couple of weeks ago in Dubai, and Mr. Hashmi, who is Faiz Ahmed Faiz's
Yeah,
grandson,
Adil was there.
he
Yeah,
was moderating
Adil Saab was there. Yeah,
Adil, yeah, Adil Hashmi. So he was moderating one of a few of the
of
sessions there,
course.
and it was just uh, so heartening to listen to him, and just he's
Yeah.
but wonderful. Thank you for adding that perspective, in fact, to my question, that you were not there to share a message. The message emerges, and that's really where the magic lies. Um, going forward, to your students now, in this day and age, as they are evolving, and to people listening in right now, what are the three things that you would tell them that they must keep in mind when immersing themselves into any art form? Could be performative, could be non performative, but any art form.
I think we have come far enough in our social history and consciousness to be mindful of space. Space, not just in the physical sense, space, not just in the, in the digital sense of, whether you're, all of that, but also in the kinds of spaces and the amount of space that one is occupying within the larger realm of, your social and cultural position, your privilege, so on.
Hmm.
So I think mindfulness of space, yet also knowing that everyone has enough space. So therefore, to not count oneself out. Everybody is an artist, and I think with the growing platforms and the growing mediums and the growing creative ways in which one can communicate, there is no end to what the possibilities are. So to cut oneself down because they don't fit in, I think is a very yesterday thing to do. You don't have to do that. I mean, I'm sorry for all the people who had to do that. We have come so far. There's enough space for everyone to thrive. We should make space for one's own self and for others. And thirdly, I would say that uh, it's very important, I think, for us to also pause and reflect and not power through. There is something very beautiful about, but I don't think young artists can understand what I'm saying, in the sense, when you're starting out, one wants to do as much as one can. So I mean, I won't blame them for that speed and agility, but I think at some point, if you are with the process long enough, somewhere, as a good artist, one will slow down and start reflecting. And that's where, truly great art will emerge, in the slowness of it all. So I greatly value slow, kind processes.
Ah, I'm going to marinate in these words for a while. But thank you, Dr. Swarnamalya. It's been so eye opening, such wonderful perspectives that I am going to take away from this and just implement on my own. I'm very grateful. Thank you very much for saying for doing everything that you do and just bringing all of this energy to this conversation and beyond.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Anuji. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. I think you've brought some, you've brought some great ideas and perspectives to me as well, and the way you're communicating and the way you've been able to put forth your questions has been so delightful. Thank you for having me on your show. Thank you so much.
Thank you.